classic literature, it is distant in time for us, and it requires a leap of faith. There's almost a paucity of imagination to even envision it. I'm not going to be able to describe today as our subject of what Messianic times are like, but rather I'd like to focus on something maybe a bit more immediate for us, and that is considering why the exile. What are the reasons for the long and as I said, often bitter exile? And we'd like to use especially the writings of Rabbi Yaakov, Emden, and we'll talk about that shortly. Just by way of introduction, though, perhaps we'll look at the top source that you have in Hebrew. I'm aware that this page has mostly Hebrew, mostly in the Rashi script as well. I know we have a very learned audience here this evening, but I recognize it in some cases. The Rashi script may be unfamiliar as well, so we'll try to go through it carefully. Anyway, at the top of the page, we have a very well-known passage. If it's not well-known to you, then let me be the first to share it with you. Gemara in Shabbos. We're going to start not at the very top of it, actually, but the third line, towards the end of the third line, it's really the second complete line. Amar Rava b'shah shemachnisen adam ladin. At the time, after 120 years, sometimes sooner, when a person is called before judgment in his final reckoning, and he's summoned before the heavenly throne. Omri, well, they say to him a number of questions. This is a very interesting Gemara. I've cited it here because of one of them, but perhaps we'll contemplate briefly some of the other components as well. It's not a long passage, you can see for yourselves. Omri lo nasasa v'nasata be'emuna. Did you buy and sell? Did you trade? Were your commercial activities conducted in a spirit of honesty, be'emuna, with faithfulness? Then the next question, kavata itim la Torah. Did you designate fixed times for the study of Torah? I just want to mention that I saw recently the Shari Tshuva. It's a parish on the Orach Chaim, on the Shulchan Aruch. So he quotes from the Hafla, a very beautiful idea. Kavata, the kavoa is to designate, to set fixed times. That's the simple meaning. But we do find a pasuk in Yeshaya where it's pasuk in Mishlei actually. The pasuk in Mishlei says the what's the lashon kavati is kovehem nefesh. The word there, the kavoa means to steal. So kavata itim la Torah can mean, have you stolen time to learn Torah? Have you snatched time away from your other interests, maybe from your business or from your commercial enterprises? Have you found a way to cling to that time, to capture the time for the study of Torah? Because if a person doesn't seek to do that, then the time will pass away, and he won't get to his Torah study. This kavata itim la Torah. Of course, the simple meaning is, have you designated fixed times for the study of Torah? Asakta the period of Olivia. Have you endeavored to bring children into the world? Tzipisa la Yeshua. Have you anticipated the redemption in your life on earth? Did you look forward to the redemption? And of course, that's what's relevant to us. And you see, it is among these very limited questions. We'll just read through the rest of them as well. Pilpalta b'chachma. Did you use the mind that Hashem has given you for the pursuit of wisdom? Pilpalta b'chachma. Hevanta davar mitoch davar. Have you also used your powers of intuition to see beyond the facade, to look deeper into life? Lavi davar mitoch davar. And with all of that, even if his answers are in the affirmative and all of those, and he's doing very well. I don't remember how many there are here, 6 or 7. Yeah, if he's batting 1,000, as we say in America, to ask him one more question. Yiras Hashem hi otsaro im. If Yiras Hashem is your storehouse, if you have stockpiled within your soul, Yiras Shamayim, fear of heaven, in, then they let you in, which I'm just saying is a pun. In means yes. It means they let you in to the pearly gates. It's probably not a Jewish concept anyway, but the pearly gates. And if not, if it is not the case, if Yiras Shamayim is not the basis of your life, then even if you've done well in all the other questions, then you struck out. I saw one of the Mefarshim says that it's, well, okay, we'll just see what the Gemara says. Masha la'adam, since just we have it here, so read the rest of it. Masha la'adam sham lishlucho ha'alei likur chitin la'aliyah. A person says to an employee, bring up to the attic, that's, I guess, what he used for a grain, a core of wheat, quite a large volume of wheat. Halach v'he'elelo, so he did it, he carried out his mission. Amarlo, iravta li bahen kav chomtin. Did you mix within the grain kav chomtin? It was something that was like a preservative. It would inhibit a mildew or something like that. Amale lav, he said, no, I forgot to do that. Amale mutav imlo elisa, then it would have been better not to exert yourself to bring it all into the storage because it's just going to rot. That's the mashal here, that if a person does not have Yiras Shamayim, then all of those other achievements are fatally undermined. I saw one of the Muslim Sfarim, I don't remember which one, that it's like a string of pearls. A string of pearls, if you buy expensive pearls, which I have bought a couple of times in my life, expensive pearls, so they knot each one, each pearl is knotted separately. But if you get inexpensive ones, they just put them on the string, they knot at the end, you give it to your wife or a girlfriend, whoever it might be, and then that's fine until it breaks. When it breaks, you lose all the pearls. So that it's like the knot at the end of the pearls is Yiras Shamayim. If you don't have Yiras Shamayim, then all those other qualities which are praiseworthy and essential, but their value is fatally undermined. Okay, that's just by the by, because our main point is observing Tzipisa la Yeshua is one of the questions that a person is asked after 120 years. And as I mentioned, to a great extent, it's worthwhile, at least during these weeks of the year, to reinforce our sense of yearning for the world that should be, that can be, and that in Mitzvah Hashem will yet be in our lifetimes. It's a transformed world, and part of the problem, as we see shortly, is that we don't actually feel the loss of the Beis Hamikdash. We don't feel the anguish of our exile from our land, and we don't possibly realize how awry our world really is in the current state of affairs.
It's a lot easier to make time for Torah study than it is to action Yiras Shamayim.
That could be, because one is a technical exercise.
Yeah.
And if you're good at time management, then you program it into your day or into your week. But as you say, to take it to heart perhaps is harder. On the other hand, that designating times for Torah study at least is a start, because it hopefully will be a conduit to the Yiras Shamayim as well. I'd like to make a further observation about, in my view, the importance of this subject. We often use the time or are prompted to consider the tragedies of Jewish life, the suffering that we as a nation have undergone, even in recent times, even within our lifetimes, events in Israel or elsewhere that have led to terrible tragedy and loss of life. And we see this as part of the price of exile, but the consequence of exile. And especially if you're like me, you have an interest in Jewish history. So especially, as I say, these weeks of the year on Tisha B'Av itself, particularly, we may consider the tragedies and those who have inflicted upon us such suffering. The Babylonians and the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans and the Visigoths and the Crusaders and the Inquisitors and the Cossacks. The thing is that it's easy to heap scorn and contumely upon those people who are long since gone. They've perished centuries ago, and it's not mechayev us. What is the value of recognizing or even condemning those who have inflicted suffering upon us and often upon the rest of the world as well. That by itself is not going to bring us anywhere worthwhile. On the contrary, it's a way, sometimes of deflecting the responsibility and saying it's because of what those people have done to us. And again, Jewish history is full of those records, and it can be a valuable study in its own right. But at the same time, in terms of personal growth, what does it really add to us? So, with that somewhat extended introduction, I'd like to now take a look at the approach of Rabbi Yaakov Emden to our question. Many have written about this question, and one of the great, very eclectic, colorful personalities of one of the rabbinic all-stars of the last, I guess you could say, 500 years, is a man known as Rabbi Yaakov Emden. He was the Av based in for a short while in the town of Emden, and his name became associated with that town. He never liked it. He said, "Don't call me Yaakov Emden." He said, I wish I ever set foot there. He says, I don't want to remember them. I don't even wish them well. He said, the people of Emden. He said, for that matter, I wish I never was an Av based in. He says, I make a bracha every morning, Shalom Asani Evet, Av based in. He's a very colorful personality, a great man, a person of outstanding Torah knowledge. He wrote very widely in many subjects, and he published a Siddur in 1745 called, it became known as Siddur Beis Yaakov. You can still buy it. I bought it myself years ago. We bought it more recently as a gift for our son-in-law. It's in 2 volumes now, and it has an extensive commentary, and in some places he writes at great length and in a very fascinating vein. And he has on the laws of Bein HaMetzarim, the weeks of the between the fast of Tammuz and Tisha B'Av, he has an extended essay about many halachos, and he indulges, I don't want to use the word indulgent, he takes the opportunity to share with his reader some of his thoughts on our question, why the exile? So let's take a look at that. So it's in source number 2 for those who have it in front of you. He mentions here the halacha, which is found in Shulchan Aruch Hazot, no saying Efer Mikla Barosho. When a bridegroom goes to the bridal canopy, so he should place on his forehead where the tefillin are positioned, which is just above the hairline, he should place, or someone should do on his behalf, should place Efer Mikla is ashes. B'makom hanachas hatefillin. And there's a kind of remez that titain efer tachas pe'er. Efer is dust or ashes. Tachas pe'er. Pe'er means glory. The tefillin are called pe'er. Pe'er chavush alecha. So when a man wears tefillin, it symbolizes the presence of Hashem. So this is pe'er, and that's probably why we don't wear tefillin on Tisha B'Av in the morning, only in the afternoon. But the chasen places Efer Tachas Pe'er. And the reason is to recall the destruction of Yerushalayim. We have an echo of this that we say for chuppah in Nishkachech Yerushalayim, and we break the class, which may be associated with that as well. I do not elevate Jerusalem above my highest joy. So it says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, Gam bezu eina nizharin. People are not careful, not exacting to uphold this minhag, and it doesn't invalidate the chuppah, it doesn't invalidate the wedding, but he says this is an important minhag to remember Yerushalayim at that time. And then he adds a few words, and I've got a theory, difficult to substantiate. My theory is, nowadays, every Masada Kedushin who does his job properly is careful to do this minhag. I've done it myself on the times that I've been Masada Kedushin, and the chassid himself has other things on his mind. It's a responsibility of the Masada Kedushin to perform it, and it's quite widely upheld nowadays. I wonder if it's upheld partly because of what he writes right here. Rabbi Yaakov Emden says, "Mi yodeya, who knows? Shema kama lo Maybe there are some marriages that went pear-shaped, they went kaput because they didn't bother with this minhag. Who knows? I mean, you read that, it makes you think, well, this is something I don't want to neglect. And he says, She'enam samim alev avedus Yerushalayim be'esim chasam, that they don't bother to give a moment's thought to the destruction of Jerusalem and the sadness that we should all feel at that time, the time of his joy. So this is one thing he says that I think it's interesting. I told you my theory, maybe because he almost expresses an implication here. Maybe this is why some marriages have not flourished. Okay, let's go on to the next passage. These are selections, by the way. He goes on for several pages. These are selections. He says, okay, take it from the end of that top line. He says, let me say a few words. Like the famous speaker said, before I begin, let me say a few words. Let me take the opportunity. He said, this is something that I want to share with my reader. If this was the only transgression of which we as a nation are guilty, that we don't mourn properly for Jerusalem, that would be enough of a reason for the prolonging of our exile. He says that alone would be enough. The fact that we don't want to be redeemed, that by itself would be sufficient explanation for why the exile is so prolonged. This is the most compelling reason. All of the terrible and intense persecution, says this, in my view, is enough explanation by itself for all of the suffering, all of the persecution, all of the exiles that have been forced upon us. Because we don't feel the sadness any longer. We don't feel that we're missing anything. It's interesting. He says historically we've suffered a lot. He said, but right now, he lived in Germany and that area generally. It was a time of relative prosperity and relative stability for Jewish life. They had a lot of other problems. We may comment about that as well. But in terms of persecution, things were not that bad in his time. And he says, when we are at peace in a land which is not ours, then we say, okay, shalom alai nakshi, things are okay with me. So I don't remember the exile. We've forgotten Jerusalem, doesn't even occur to us. Therefore, we are also to speak has forgotten about us. Generation after generation, our distress was more intense. Whoever loves truth will acknowledge the truth of what I'm saying. So especially on the bitter day of Tisha B'Av. Who is it who properly actually mourns on that day? Al Churban Habayis, V'Shamus Artseinu, and the desolation of our land, Karaui, Mima'ameke Halei, from the depths of his heart. Kamedim Os Nishkachos, Nishvachos, Alzos. How many tears are really shed on this day? So Chlomar, and you don't even have to say, V'Shari Me'ashar, the rest of the year. Of course, Ein Zocher, Ve'ein Kokei, nobody thinks about it at all. Ve'ein Dover Davar Mimena, Afilu B'machshava, even a thought, a passing thought, Lo Bazichrona, Ki'ilu Mikrahu Hayalana. It just happenstance that occurred to us. So he's elaborating, as he promised, on this theme. We don't really miss it enough. We don't really mourn in a meaningful way. and we have repeated the wrongdoing of our ancestors, to follow the ways of the nations of the world, from which derived all of our problems in the first place. And now he warms to his theme with some specific examples. So in number 4, continuing on, he here speaks about 2 things that are troubling him, that he feels are, again, contributing factors. He says, Shtaim heina kor osav hashod v'hashever. He says there are 2 things which are responsible for the devastation and the fracture. Kishut ha'akrum. He says the following the fashions of the nations of the world, the halim hachitzoni, and the fascination or even the embrace of secular philosophy. These are the factors that have caused the Jewish people to betray their God. From early days, to follow the ways of the nations of the world. I just want to make a historical comment here. I mean, the fashion, as we shall see, he was writing in the 18th century. It has, to my mind, at least quite a contemporary feel. The secular philosophy is not much in vogue nowadays. Now it's technology that people are excited about, certain other things. But in his time, philosophy wasn't just like sort of primitive or forgotten discipline in a university curriculum that no one is really very interested in. It wasn't that way. Philosophy represents the entire endeavor of science, the entire endeavor of understanding the world, the natural sciences, the efforts to understand medical advances. In other words, not that these things are inherently wrong, but it was the fascination and the embrace of all manner of secular sorts of discipline and knowledge, and to admire and to be like besotted with those who are considered wise in those areas, to the neglect of the Torah. But he elaborates on this theme, continue in the next part. Excuse me?
Was involved with the coffee house.
The coffee house culture, yeah, it's true, it's interesting. He himself, Rabbi Emden, was criticized for going to a coffee house here in London. He had an interesting exchange with another rabbi who rebuked him. He said, I heard you would drink coffee in London. So he had to write a whole tshuva explaining himself, justifying himself. It's interesting. But we'll see that he was a very multifaceted personality. This one. So at the top of the following column, left-hand column, says even if we still pay lip service to Torah study and to Jewish culture, he said, but that's not really what excites us. He says, הנחמדה המכובדת גם בעיני כל העמים היודעים ומכירים כבודם. He says that even the Torah, we don't actually study it with the same enthusiasm and the same attention that the Christians do. Because he says, he says in parentheses, halavai shiyu b'nei amim b'mikra kamosa. Our b'nei amim, if only Jews were as motivated, as exacting in their study of Mikra, of the scriptures. Lulei zos ulai hayu rabim me'amei haaretz mashlichim ulam me'aleihem. And the next word, we start. Yeah, that's right. He says that the Jewish people, instead, we are very jealous of the nations of the world to follow their fashions. Haim Unishayim Benehem Uvnosayim, the men, the wives, the sons, the daughters, B'diyuch Gadol, with great attentiveness. V'chol Moda Chadasha, every new fashion, every new fad. We must meet him. Machmirim al atzman, perhaps a bit sarcastic here. They're very machmir, they're very stringent with them. Says medaktikim bahem yosem ha'amim hahem hamachadshim osam. The Jews are more exacting in the latest fashion, more so even than the fashion houses that produce them. Ulaolam tira afridam shareses even a Jewish maid. She will be more, avant-garde in her clothing. Loveshes miyad hamalbush hamoda chadash b'tchilaso. As soon as it comes out, as soon as it's released on the catwalk, so she'll rush out to Bond Street to pick up the latest. Because how she can afford it on a maid's salary, I don't know. The terem nispashet bein hamon am haaretz. Even before it's widely embraced by others, the Jewish women are going to be in the forefront. And the men too, he says, he criticizes the men with this also. So he says it's their the devotion to the latest fashion. Then he speaks about the secular philosophy. Number 6, v'im kol zeh gam hayom lo sar hatzar hazeh. He said, even so, even now, we're still grappling, we're still burdened. Gam bedor hagalu pachos halazeh, in this impoverished generation. Nimsa shualim ketanim v'chablim kerem Hashem tzvakos alidei limud philosophia bachokrim v'shoalim, who are so interested in philosophy and in, as I said, the secular wisdom generally. The Imras Kadosh Israel Niatzu v'Torah so go'alim. They spurn, they neglect, they even reject the Torah. These corrupted people, they don't know right from left. Even if they're very arrogant, they're full of conceit about their knowledge, but he says their knowledge of Chachma is very superficial. They're losing out on both. They've left the study of Torah, they have abandoned the study of Torah, and they haven't even reached philosophy. In other words, they're just in a kind of no man's land. Their knowledge of Torah is superficial, and their knowledge of secular philosophy, secular wisdom is also superficial. The darka lo ra'u, they don't even understand. Lariki yagau Hashem pashu b'Torah. So the I'll just skip a little bit where it's underlined. He says, "Va'anochi hayodea va'ei." He says, "I can testify. I know about it. Ki shakadati al sifra philosophia v'bacharusi." When I was young, I spent a lot of time studying philosophy. As I said, he was a very eclectic personality. He was a genius, and he had a very broad intellectual horizons. It's a bit like my other friend, Chida. V'dag sham umitkam matzisi. I have extracted the sweetness and the honey, the klipasan zarakti, and the klipa, the rind, I've discarded. Okay, he's referring to us as Rabbi Meir, that he found a pomegranate and he consumed the seeds and he discarded the peel of the pomegranate. That's Rabbi Meir, who studied from Elisha ben Avuya. Okay, that's what he's alluding to. Lahag harbe yegia basar b'divrei matzasi v'korach ruach lo ra'isi. He said, I saw a lot of nourishkeit there, and anything really meaningful I didn't discover. Lo hein v'lo scharan chafatzti. She was with me. I banished her. It means the secular philosophy. He said, I didn't find any really wisdom or lasting meaning in that. And then he has another subject, which is one of his bugaboos, which I think is quite interesting. He says, take a look, consider about how ignorant we Jews are, it means the Hamon Am, in the Hebrew language, even the proper understanding of the Hebrew language. Consider those who represent us. They stand before the Amud to lead the congregation in prayer. They array the prayers of the congregation before the heavenly throne. They discharge the obligation of the community. Someone who's not expert and consider their expertise in the holy tongue. Why should I elaborate on that which is clear to everyone? Once I heard from a learned, he's saying it sarcastically, a learned Shaliach Tzibor, he wanted to display his precise usage of the Hebrew language, his precise pronunciation. Here, the Birchas Hashkivenu, in the matter of prayer, when he got to the Bracha Hashkivenu, Az amarti lo ata tishmor motzas vasecha v'shavti b'chisisa seasecha. Now, if you know what it means, then you get the humor here. He's saying that the Shaliach Tzibor, in his ignorance, he was trying to show off, and he's making a hash of it. We'll just leave it at that. Okay, Shamati Rabos. I've heard lots of things like this, but me, my stomach was aching. Probably with the achiness so outside, I can't even bring myself to express. From here, you can extrapolate to the rest of the people. This was a Shluchei Tzibor like. A colleague of mine here in London was a rabbi in a certain community. I won't say which one, but it wasn't in this area, an Anglo-Jewish community. And he said that there was a fellow who was leading the prayers. Probably he was saying Kaddish, and he said that it was painful to hear him because he was, the tefillah was of such a poor standard. He said one time he would say the bracha Baruch Muchulal Batishbachos. He says, and then I said Amen. Melech Muchulal Batishbachos. Okay. She should say Melech Muchulal, the king who is praised with praise. Yeah. But instead it said Mechulal. Mechulal means profaned. So he's the king who's profaned with praise because the fellow doesn't pronounce the Hebrew. So what do we see here? I mean, just to review. So he says the general thing, all of the humor aside, he says that the general thing, he says that we don't miss it enough. Like in my opening little, joke about Seder from Mashiach, that to a very great extent, we don't really feel the discomfort, we don't feel the pain, we don't feel the displacement at all. And we don't mourn for the destruction. And okay, we don't have the time for it right now, but there are many things that we should incorporate into our lives that are a reminder of the Korban. And certainly this one about the ashes on the head of the bridegroom. I mean, it's not something which happens every day. A person when he gets married, but at least it's a kind of exemplar of the principle. Then he has spoken about the aping and almost trying to emulate or even excel in the habits, the fashions, and the fads of the nations of the world. And with the reference to the secular philosophy, the presumption that secular wisdom somehow must be superior to Torah wisdom. And then, as we've seen, the Hebrew language, the ignorance of the Hebrew language, which he considers again to be something that's an example of why the exile is prolonged. Which, by the way, there are indications of that earlier, even in Tanakh, we find such a thing. When they came back from Babel, they couldn't speak Hebrew anymore, and they were speaking, a hybrid of other languages. Their understanding of the Hebrew language was very poor. In general, I want to comment upon and commend what we heard from Ronnie Cohen at Shulash Yeshit yesterday. He made a very astute point. He said that Bilam, he was an internationalist, and he was he was hostile, keen to curse the Jews because the Jews are particularists. And in a way, that's what Rabbi Yaakov Emden is saying as well. He says we need to be proud of what we are. We need to study and to delight and to take pleasure in the Torah, to value the Torah, not to feel as if we are inferior, and therefore whatever the goyim are doing, that's what we want to do, that's what we need to do, that's how we need to dress, that's how we need to act, that's how we need to speak, that we need to emulate their ways. That doesn't mean that everything that happens in the wider world has to be shunned or neglected, but it needs to be evaluated through the prism of Torah values. It needs to be assessed in terms of what is our destiny, what is our mission, what is our responsibility, what is our function within this world. And we can achieve that best. We can only achieve it, I would say, when we're faithful to who we are. That when we are prepared to sell out or to abandon what is our patrimony in favor of whatever is trendy or fashionable in the wider society, he says this is where we have gone wrong. So again, I'm ignorant of football, so it's easy for me to say, you shouldn't be obsessed with football. I know a lot of people like football and they follow it, etc. I'm not saying there's anything terribly wrong with it. I used to like baseball once upon a time, but if a person exchanges talking and learning for talking in football, then he has surrendered the greatness to which he is heir. He has exchanged the beauty and the wisdom and the eternal, life-giving force of the Torah for something which is passing, evanescent, and ultimately, just a pastime rather than kihem chayim. So this is these are some of the thoughts of Yaakov Emden. It is interesting that he doesn't mention here what many other darshanim mention, and that is the internecine strife within the Jewish people, the machlokes, which is something which has always plagued the Jewish people. Actually, when he wrote this, he was locked in a terrible, dispute. And I guess what I just want to observe is that one could fruitfully compile his own list of factors that have contributed to the prolonging of the exile, and the lists are not mutually exclusive one of the other. But I would just conclude by saying that we have seen here in the rise of Yaakov Emden, who was one of the most brilliant and widely read, eclectic personalities, some thoughts which he wrote in the 18th century that I believe are still relevant for us. Mitzvah Hashem, we will be zocha to appreciate what we've lost to the point that we will be worthy of having the restoration of the Jewish people to intended destiny. Amen.